Amen. So we are now in week 2 of a series for Lent, 7-week sermon series, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Okay? And in this, I'm going to ask you now to turn to the book of Psalms. So the other week we were in the book of Daniel. This week we're in the book of Psalms. Psalms is a rather large book. It's about 45 to 50% of the way into the Bible, and you're going to go all the way to chapter 77. I didn't change it on the slide. That's not bad. But we are in Psalm 77, 1 to 20. Okay? So, as you turn there, get situated, get ready. I'm going to ask you this. Have you ever had one of these types of nights? Maybe you've had one of these types of nights recently where you were absolutely, completely exhausted. You were super tired. You're still yawning. And yet, you cannot sleep. You know those nights?
Absolutely.
Oh, they're miserable, right? Your body is super tired. Your eyes burn, but your mind, y'all, I speak often about my ADD. My mind sometimes doesn't want to turn off. You want it to turn off, and you wish there was a switch, like somewhere up here, right, that you could flip and just be done. But your mind won't turn off. And in it, what you might be doing is from like earlier in the day, you just start replaying conversations. Some of us replay conversations that we had years ago. And we just can't turn it off. You start replaying in your head. And no, I do, like regrets that I've had, things that I would have done or could have done or should have done differently. You replay in it what you should have said or what you shouldn't have said, what you might lose and what might happen next, right? Like, so all those different thoughts. The reality is everything else around you is super quiet. The world is probably still because it's real late. But inside of your head, it's unbelievably loud. Maybe you take your pillow. I got one of those like memory foam pillows, so I can't really flip it, but maybe you have one of them like pillows that like you can flip to the cooler side of it, or you just like pull your pillowcase around, right? You flip that around. You look at the clock, it's like 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and you tell yourself, if I fall asleep now, maybe I'll still get 3 hours of sleep. I know some people who get up at 4. May the Lord bless and keep you. Okay? Sometimes, because of this, like it's because your thoughts begin circling. We call that cycling. Your thoughts and your emotions are cycling. Sometimes it comes because of anxiety. Sometimes it comes because you're in grief. Sometimes it comes because you're in guilt. Sometimes it's not even one clear thing. Does that make sense too? Mm-hmm. It's just a heavy cloud that doesn't lift. And here's the worst part of it. In moments like this, here's what often can occur. We can feel like God is not just an afterthought, but God from us is wildly far away. You pray, maybe, in these late hours. And sometimes it feels like if you're laying and you look up, a lot of us have a ceiling fan, that my prayers go up, hit the ceiling fan, and then just spread out around the room and never make it. You try to remember truth, something that somebody said or something that you've read in this wonderful book of knowledge. But what it feels like is fog. Why? Because it's 2 o'clock in the morning and you don't think clearly. But you wonder, has something changed? Did I do something, right? Why does God feel so far away or so silent? Maybe I just never felt like, and then your mind starts spiraling again. Maybe I never actually heard him. Maybe I've been really rough. Maybe that was my own voice. You lay there, you replay the conversations, replay the regrets, fears, and future. The room, dark, but your thoughts, loud. Psalms 77, which I asked you to turn to, is written by someone who knows that kind of night. There's a lot of psalms, okay? Many of them are written by David or some other people within David's circle, if you will, okay? This psalm, Psalm 77, not tidy. It's not a very sentimental one. It's not polished. What it is, though, is raw. I like when I find things like that. Because too often we think strong faith means quiet struggles. We think if you are, right, a mature Christian, that we don't struggle or we don't wrestle with what's going on around us. It's not true. It's easy for us to look on like social media or whatever and just assume and think, oh man, they got it all together. I wish I could be like that. We think real believers don't ask hard questions. I believe if you are a real believer, you are asking some of the hardest questions. Psalm 77 says otherwise. There's this guy named William Bellinger, and he writes that lament psalms like this one, so that's what we'll call this type of psalm. It's a lamenting one. This is one where somebody's expressing raw emotions and in sadness and not just fear, but in trying to find hope, right? But when somebody writes a lament psalm like this one, they are often neglected because they are difficult and haunting, and their honesty within it is really brutal, and we don't always find a lot of encouragement in it. But he says the community of faith needs them because they strengthen deeper faith. So we actually need a psalm like verse 77. Because despair is not rare. Make sense? Mm-hmm. That's not that confusing, right? I don't feel like I'm telling you anything you've never heard. Despair is not that rare. It's pretty common. In fact, if you've gone to the doctor any time recently, they often ask you 3 or 4 times when you're in the office, how do you feel? Do you feel safe at home? Do you feel these things? You know, we don't make jokes about it. We go, all right, I'm all right. And sometimes the only path out of despair is remembering somehow who God has been. So there's a sound of despair. These are in the first couple of verses of Psalm 77, verses 1 to 9. Listen to the opening words. We actually have that, I believe, on there. It says, I cry out loud to God for help. I cry out to God to hear me. Just like, let's go back to just one right there. That sounds hopeful. Okay? I cry out to God for help. I cry out to God to hear me. That almost sounds hopeful until we keep reading. Now we'll go to the next one. When I was in distress, I sought the Lord. At night I stretched out untiring hands that would not be comforted. So let's leave it right there. So here's what this guy's doing, this individual who wrote this. He is praying, he is seeking, and not finding relief. Also makes sense? Sometimes to find relief, to shut my brain off, I have right next to my bed is a whole nice thing of 10 milligram melatonin gummies. That's the best way for me to try to shut my brain off sometimes. But then here's verse 3, so now let's go to the next one. I remembered you, God, and I groaned. I meditated, and my spirit grew faint. When I remember God, I moan. Let that sink in. He remembers God, and he groans. What's a groan? How's that sound? Let me hear a good groan. You know what I mean? It's a good groan. Good job, everybody. It looks like you've had practice. Just a little. That is not devotional language that we put on coffee mugs. These are not the wallpaper things that we put on our phone. I remember you, God, and I groan. He continues. You kept my eyes from closing, and I was too troubled to speak. Leave it there. So here's what he's doing. He's blaming God for his sleeplessness. And then questions come. Let's go on to the next thing. I thought about the former days, the years long ago. Keep going. I remembered my songs in the night. My heart meditated and my spirit asked. Next one. Will the Lord reject forever? Will he never show his favor again? So here's what he's asking. Will the Lord spurn forever? His steadfast love forever cease? Has God forgotten to be gracious to me? Has he in anger shut off any sort of compassion towards me? These are not polite questions. These are desperate types of questions. Have you ever asked questions like that? Maybe not out loud and maybe not here in the church, but maybe in the quiet of your own heart when you look at the state of the world, when you face reoccurring sin, when you see injustices continue to prosper, when you feel maybe like what we'll call it spiritually stuck, we frequently fall into despair when we contemplate our sin or the evil things that are around us. And despair will distort our vision every time. Anybody here wear glasses? I mean, I can see who wears glasses. You know those points when you are just doing something and you do one of those side swipes to your glasses and you've been eating fried chicken? You know what I'm talking about? And then you can see nothing. It's distorted that whole vision, right? Got to get that cleaner out. Maybe you breathe a little fog on your thing, and you try to clean it off, and then you realize you're wearing like something scratchy, and you're like, oh no. And then you have to touch the dreaded microfiber things. You know, everybody, you know what I'm talking about? You got a little bit of crust up on your hands, and you just stick to that microfiber. Nothing to do with this message. Just needed to get that part off my chest, okay? But despair distorts our vision. It makes permanent what is temporary. It makes silence feel like abandonment. It makes waiting feel like, oh, this is heavy. Like, this is unique stuff, right? It makes waiting feel like you've been rejected or rejection. But here's something crucial. The psalmist brings his despair to God. What he's doing is he does not run from God. What he's doing instead is he runs towards him, even with questions. That's not weak type of faith. That's a bold type of faith. In verses 10 to 12 is like a turning point. And he goes, then I said, right? So verse 10 is the hinge of the entire psalm. Let's skip right over to that. We'll just go bang, bang. Yeah. Then I thought, then I said, to this I will appeal. The years when the Most High stretched out his right hand. Leave it there. Something shifts. Up until now, despair had been speaking. Now the psalmist is speaking back. This guy named John, he's got a really long name, or long last name. I'm not even going to try to butcher it. But this guy named John describes this as an inner dialogue for the psalmist. One side of the psalmist's soul is protesting. The other side is counter-arguing the protesting with memory. It's an inner dialogue thing. I was just watching, I like the show Alone. Voice or Discovery. It's on all sorts of things, and it's when contestants go and have to be alone in like the Arctic Circle and survive, and they have to be the last one to survive. Okay. And on this show, the most recent episode I was watching, this guy, and they very much are alone. There's no camera crew, so they had to do all their own stuff. And so he set up 2 cameras, and then they edited it with conversations that he was having with himself to be funny, because he was just trying to pass time. But in this is inner dialogue right here really happening. This is not denial. This is intentional redirection. Verse 11 says this: I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember the miracles of long ago. Notice the repetition. It says, I will remember. Not, I feel now, as it's like 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning, encouraged. Not my circumstances have changed. Not like, I can rest and my pain disappears. You know when you're awake just because you hurt? He makes a decision. Despair says, God has forgotten you. Faith responds, this is the other voice, right? I will remember what he has done. Despair says, this is how it's always going to be. You know when you have a cold and you forget how it feels to breathe normal? And you felt like this has been forever, your sinuses are all stuffed up, and you're like, I don't even know what it feels like to breathe right. Faith responds, I will recall his wonders. This is spiritual self-preaching. Sometimes you must preach to yourself before you can preach to anybody else. This is the type of message for me. The psalmist does not invent hope in this passage. What he's doing is he's retrieving it. He reaches into Israel's history. Pat Graham says the psalmist represents what's going on. God's past acts so that the present congregation can see themselves inside of the story. Memory becomes proclamation. Memory then gets become hope. Memory becomes encounter. And so here's what he does. He recalls the Exodus. Remember, we were part of the new Exodus, but he's remembering the first of these considered Exoduses. He says, when the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. The clouds poured out water. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. Here's what the psalmist is doing. He's remembering the Red Sea. When Israel was trapped, when the Pharaoh was behind them, when the sea was in front of them, when everything looked impossible with the story. Maybe you watched The Prince of Egypt long ago. I don't know. Maybe you haven't even heard the story of the Exodus for a long time. The Israelites were running from the Egyptians who had just set them free, and then kind of impartial changed their mind and said, hey, wait a minute. We have a lot of work to be done. You all better go back here. And then they made it to the Red Sea, and they said, what are you going to do? And Moses took a staff after talking to the Lord, stuck it in the ground, and then the water said, whoop. Maybe you watched Bruce Almighty, who did that with a coffee cup. Okay. When it looked impossible for the people to get through, God made a way through. But notice this line in it. It says, your footprints were unseen. God was working, but his steps were invisible. You find comfort in that?
Yeah.
That's interesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
God was working, but his steps were invisible. That's the message. Trust in God's care. Trust in Yahweh's care, even when you cannot understand the movements. There's like that clever poem. You ever seen that? Like the Footprints in the Sand poem? This isn't counter that. This is like included within that. Sometimes the only way forward is to remember that God has worked before, even when his footprints were hidden to you.
Amen.
But if we're honest, remembering can hurt. Remembering feels at points painful. Sometimes, like I said, remembering hurts. Earlier in the Psalms it says, I considered the days of old. And instead of comfort, it increases his sorrow. Memory doesn't immediately soothe him. Instead, what it does is it intensifies the pain and the ache. Because memory can feel like contrast. God used to feel near. I used to feel joy. I used to see growth. I used to sense his presence. And now, silence. Stillness, dryness, distance. Last week we talked about how lament gave us permission to say what hurt in the presence of God. We said that real faith doesn't edit out the hard parts. It doesn't skip from pain to praise in one sentence. Often it lingers and it wrestles. It names what's broken. In Psalm 77, it shows us that remembering can be part of that wrestling. Because when you remember what used to be, and it doesn't match what is going on right now, it can feel worse before it feels better. You remember a season maybe for you where prayer felt alive. Now it feels mechanical. You remember a time when worship moved your heart, but now it feels like we're just moving our mouths and just getting through it. I remember a time not that long ago. So this song that we were singing just a moment ago was "The Goodness of God." We played that song at the celebration of life for my dear friend who just passed away recently from cancer. And I remember sitting in that moment, and I had sung that song many times before. And we sang that song. I had sung a song in my car in anger, right? I was listening to it, and I heard like this one particular part. It says, "With every breath that I am able," and I kind of just froze on that. You know those moments when you're just trying to like catch your breath, and you're trying to just like figure out what's going on, and you're like, I don't know if I have a lot to offer you. But with every breath that I'm able to do it, and I remember then, so then fast forward, I'm standing next to my dear friend's son, whose mommy's going now, right? And I'm watching this young little boy, 10 years old, 9, 10 years old, singing with gusto. Like, with deep breath. I watch my other friend, her husband, who's burying a spouse, sing deeply while wrestling even deeper with the Lord. I don't know where you're good at this. And yet, somehow, we still sing the goodness of God. You remember when you were walking in obedience, and now you may feel stuck in the pattern that you can't seem to fake or shake. Memory becomes contrast, and contrast produces within us sorrow. But here's where we must be careful. There are two very different ways to remember. One way that we can remember is nostalgia. Make sense? You know nostalgia? Nostalgia says these are the good old days. Nostalgia says I'm going to keep this even though it's broken. Okay? I hear some giggles because I get it. Sometimes we just hold on to it because it feels good. It's not useful anymore. It'll never work again. You could give it to Matt. Matt could probably fix it, okay? But for the most part, it's broken. Maybe you think God did something really good back then that He isn't doing right now because culture changes. I could offer you guys all the excuses and things in the world for why the church looks totally different. From the early 2000s to the 90s to the 80s. I don't know anything past the 80s, sorry. But you know what I'm saying? Nostalgia freezes God in the past. It says, He was faithful then, but I am not sure that He is right now. That kind of remembering leads to despair. But biblical remembrance is different. Biblical remembrance does not say, look how good it used to be. Y'all, I don't think I want to live in the Exodus. I don't think I want to wander for 40 years on my feet. I don't think I want to eat things that fall from the sky that translates to, what is this? That's the translation of manna. What even is this? Like there's these stories where we go, look how good it used to be. Instead, what the biblical remembrance is saying is, look who God has always been. Amen. Look who He's always been within these things. The psalmist is not longing for some sort of emotional high years ago. He is anchoring himself to the character of God. Amen. He is not remembering a feeling, but he's remembering His faithfulness. And who God was is who God is. Again, last week we said that lament is an act of faith because you are still talking to God even when you don't understand Him. This week, we see the next movement. Remembrance is an act of faith because you are refusing to let the present redefine who God is. The present does not get to rewrite God's character. Silence does not cancel His steadfast love for you. Delay does not ease His mercy. Your struggle does not undo His promises. Sometimes remembering hurts because it exposes the gap between where you are and where you want to be. There's this movie that came out in the 90s called The Lion King. Maybe you've seen it, maybe you haven't, but there is a scene where the monkey, Rafiki, smacks Simba in the face with a stick. Okay? And Simba says, ouch, that hurts. And he goes, you'll remember that hurt, won't you? Think about the past. He goes, yeah, well, sometimes remembering the past hurts. But here's how I see it. You can either learn from it or run from it. And so, Rafiki goes to smack him in the face with a stick again. Simba catches the stick. He learned from it. It is the proof that you are still in the story. Amen. And stories have chapters. The Red Sea came after slavery. The wilderness, the Exodus, came before the promised land. Exile came before restoration. If you judge God only by the current chapter, you may misread the entire story of your life. Amen. So yeah, remembering can hurt. The way I see it, you can either run from it or learn from it. It can bring tears before it brings comfort. If you press through the first wave of sorrow, you may in fact discover something steady underneath of it. That's where we wrestle with that passage where it talks about the Lord works all things for good. And we don't see all the times all those good little things. The God who was faithful then is faithful now. Amen. Maybe we have to take multiple steps before we get to what we want. it is interesting when we can look at the faithfulness of what God has done within those moments. For we are still here. God has not evolved. He has not grown tired of you. He has not run out of grace towards you. And when remembering shifts from nostalgia to, we'll call it theology, from what I feel to who he is, that's when despair begins to loosen its grip. Because your hope was never supposed to rest in how close you felt to God. It rests in who God has proven himself over and over and over to be.
Amen.
And that changes everything. Sometimes despair isn't about circumstances. Sometimes it's about our own sin. We look at our failures and think, surely God has to now be done with me. John Bunyan says, we need broken hearts because we are proud and we must be humbled, self-willed and must be broken, lovers of sin who must be weaned from it. A broken heart, y'all know, feels yucky. But it is grace. Because when you see sin clearly, you also see your need for mercy all the more clearly. Despair says you've messed up too badly. Remembrance says his steadfast love has never ceased.
Amen.
Love me through my yuck. If the cross was enough yesterday, guess what? It's still enough today. Your failure does not outgrow his faithfulness. There's a movie that came out a couple years ago. It's called Inside Out. There's a young girl named Riley who spirals. Remember how we were saying that word before, spiraling? Spirals when she loses connection to her core memories in this movie. The film makes a simple point. You cannot live well by suppressing difficult emotions. Joy alone isn't enough. Sadness has a role and fear has a role. In Psalm 77, it shows us something similar. The psalmist doesn't suppress despair. He brings it to God. All the questions, all the fear, all the sorrows, he processes them in the presence of God. We don't run from painful parts of our story. We bring them to the Lord. And when we do, memory reshapes them. As we get ready to close again, in verse 19 of this, your way was through the sea, yet your footprints were unseen. God was present and God was active, but his steps were invisible. This is often how it feels. You can't see what he's doing in your family. You can't see all the time what he's doing in your household, what he's doing in your church, what he's doing in your own heart. But unseen footprints do not mean they are absent footprints.
Amen.
Verse 20 ends the psalm this way. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. Not chaos, not abandonment, shepherding. The God who splits the sea still leads his people.
Amen.
Psalm 77 doesn't end with a circumstance change. It ends with a perspective change. The psalmist moves from has God forgotten to God leads his flock. His way out of despair was remembrance, and so is ours. When you are overwhelmed by your sin, remember the cross. When you are overwhelmed by evil, remember the resurrection. When you are looking to overcome evil by good. When you are overwhelmed by uncertainty, remember the Red Sea. When you cannot see the footprints, remember the shepherd.
Amen.
You may not feel differently immediately, but faith is not on building feelings for you. It is built on who God has proven himself to be. So when despair whispers, speak back. I will remember the deeds of the Lord.
Amen.
And the God who was faithful then will still be faithful now. Amen?
Amen.
We're going to close the service. We're going to be closing the service the same way for the next couple, all the way through Lent. Where we're going to sing this song, The Blessing, together. It's a form of benediction. It's this prayer that I've been praying for you, church family,